Hello. Now that winter is turning into spring, I thought it might be nice just to take a walk around Barnwood. Have a look at some of the more interesting buildings and learn a little bit about the history. So join me on a walk around Barnwood. So we'll start our tour at the spiritual heart of Barnwood, at St Lawrence Church, which is certainly the oldest building in the parish, for it is contemporaneous with the building of the Abbey of St Peter's in Gloucester, what we call today Gloucester Cathedral. It was not always this size, it was a lot smaller, for we know that the tower was built by Abbot Parker, the last abbot of the abbey in Gloucester. Around the church there are some interesting bits and pieces to look at, so we'll take a look at the church before we leave and go down Barnwood Avenue.
Church dates from about 1100, as I said, built about the same time as the Abbey of St Peter's in Gloucester, probably by the same teams of masons, for the church has the same mason's mark in it as may be found in the nave of Gloucester Cathedral. The abbey lands of which Barnwood was a part were extensive, and it is most likely that this was originally a small chapel built by the abbey for the nearby courthouse. Its position is interesting, for it is some way south of the main road that leads into Gloucester from the east. It is alongside a lane that leads to Matson. Originally, possibly just a small chapel dating from the late 10th century, a nave was added soon after, then a north aisle and a tower which followed some time later. This print by license shows the church standing alone, surrounded just by fields, with Robinswood Hill visible in the distance. Several features of the church have changed since this drawing, including the window at the east end, the shape of the tower, pinnacles, and the absence of a window in the porch. What has not changed and is very visible in this drawing is the double bell cote, standing high at the west end of the sanctuary. Many churches have bell cotes which house just a single bell, the Sanctus bell, which would be rang at the elevation of the host during the Eucharist. Barnwood's double bell cote is unusual, for this is just one of very few such on churches in and around the Cotswolds. Whether it did house two bells is not known for certain. Even as late as 1935, as this snowy picture taken in Church Lane shows, the church stood in isolation. The wall of the grounds of Barnwood House Hospital can be seen on the right of this picture, and the four walkers are walking on the original lane that today can still be walked alongside Church Lane. The main entrance to the church has always been off Church Lane. Today it is a gated entrance leading through the graveyard to the north door of the church. But these two foundations further southward up Church Lane are the remains of another entrance, the church's Lich Gate. This new Lich Gate was dedicated on Thursday the 3rd of November 1921. Not only a fitting entrance, but also a war memorial. It was constructed partly from the oak bell frame, which was removed from the tower when the bells were refurbished and rehung in 1913. The roof was covered in old Cotswold stone tiles to be in keeping with the church. Sadly, it suffered vandalism and damage, and in June 1966 it was removed. The names of the war casualties were recorded on stone slabs and placed in the floor of the Lady Chapel. This view clearly shows the church chimney and stack, which are visible next to the south door. A coal-fired stove was positioned just inside the door. Both chimney and stove were removed in the middle of the 20th century. Almost all of the photographs of the church were taken either from the east or from the north. However, this one is an exception, as it is from the southwestern elevation and was taken about 1905 by F.J. Brooke, the well-known Gloucester photographer. At that time, the church tower had both a flagpole and a weather vane that featured the traditional cockerel. Today, the parish centre obscures that view and the weather vane has gone. The centre was opened in 2001. Near the church's south entrance are three interesting sundials. All of them are unusually placed. This one, to the west of the south door, is somewhat weathered and difficult to see. It is also vertical rather than horizontal. This one is on the eastern buttress of the south door and must have been moved from elsewhere, as it seems to be upside down. So could it be that these two were placed here when the south wall of the nave was rebuilt and the doorway opened up somewhere around 1874? Quite possibly these old mastiles, as they're sometimes called, and which are showing considerable signs of erosion and weathering, may have been part of the church for several centuries. Barnwood was a rural parish, and labourers would have had no means of telling when important church services, such as the Mass, were due to begin. A wooden peg would have been inserted into the hole, and a shadow cast would have indicated whether or not the stipulated time for the service had arrived. A third and more conventional dial rests high up on the southwest facing buttress of the tower. At that height and at that angle, its use must have been limited. Again, was this moved from elsewhere? It certainly looks as if it was a later addition. Alongside the north porch is another item that has been moved over the years. This interesting stone is the base of the old medieval parish cross, sometimes referred to as the preaching cross. Probably dates from the late 14th century and was most likely sited close to Barnwood Court next door. The base is hewn out of a single piece of stone. Whether the original cross was made from stone or wood is a matter of conjecture. But the cross would have been the place of gathering for priests and people when a procession would be formed and perhaps a litany sung as they walked together into the church. At some stage, the cross and its base became separated and the cross was lost. The base was moved to its present site in 1935. The church tower, which was an addition to the church in 1514, was built by the last abbot of Gloucester, William Parker, who was sometimes known as William Malvern. Parker was both an accomplished architect and a builder, and a number of years earlier he had done some work on Barnwood Court, though some consider this tower is not his finest work. At the base of the tower is the west door, which was renovated in 1993 in memory of Michael Seacombe, a former much-loved vicar of the parish. Either side of the lintel above the door can be seen two shields. The one on the right, the staggered gaze, is that of Abbot Parker. The one on the left is that of the Abbey of St. Peter, with the crossed keys of St. Peter. From the top of the tower, there is a splendid view of Barnwood and the surrounding area. This view, looking westwards, shows Gloucester Royal Hospital in the distance, with the hills beyond. Closer in, at the bottom right of the picture, is the bungalow, which is the parish vicarage. Barnwood has had a number of vicarages. The first, in Colin Road, was built in 1873 by the vicar Hugh Fowler. A desire by Canon Newt to be closer to the church when he became vicar in 1936 resulted in the purchase of Barnwood Court as a vicarage. This is the large white building you can see in the middle of the picture. Now no longer a vicarage, it was for a long time the home of the Reverend and Mary Seacombe. But before it was a vicarage, it was a private residence, occupied most notably by the Cullers family. In this view, the distant hospital block has yet to be constructed, and the gas holder in Horton Road dominates the area. At the bottom of the picture can be seen 3 of the 5 pinnacles that are said to have come from St Mary de Crypt. Recent research has proven this not to be the case, and now, today, only 3 remain. Barnwood Court has always been a large and significant house within Barnwood. This picture from an 1882 sales brochure, when it and its extensive lands were sold, shows a slightly idealized drawing, but a reasonably accurate one nevertheless. It depicts an aspect of the house and grounds that is not visible these days. It is difficult to be precise regarding the origins of Barnwood Court. Whether the present building stands on the site of an earlier building, or can itself be dated back to the 13th century, is not certain. Certainly it has had many alterations and additions over the years, and there is some evidence of a medieval timber frame construction. And it is probable that this building was for a time the manor court for the Abbey of St Peter's in Gloucester. Although not typically built with strong fortifications, many manor houses were partly fortified. They were enclosed within walls or ditches that often included the farm buildings as well. There is some evidence that such a ditch surrounded the lands of Barnwood Court. It would seem that the house was originally a timber frame building with low stone walls, much smaller than today. Its primary feature would have been a great hall to which subsidiary apartments were added over the following years. Probably a small chapel originally stood alongside, which would have been sufficient for the needs of the abbots. The last abbot of St Peter's Abbey, William Parker, as I've mentioned, had a great influence on Barnwood Court. For under Parker's directions, the northern portion of the court was pulled down and rebuilt with strong stone walls. In 1517, Abbot Parker granted his elder brother, Humphrey Parker, the lease. The Parker family then lived there for over a century, until about 1631. This sales map shows the layout of the estate in 1882. Here circled we have the church, and here the house and its adjoining farm buildings. These included stables and kennels. To the south of the estate, there was a large lake, much bigger than the church. This is still there today, somewhat overgrown. It is in the gardens of some of the old houses in Barnwood Avenue, and may also be detected from the pathway alongside the school behind. Leading from the house is a long tree-lined avenue, highlighted here. This crosses the wooden brook on its way to Barnwood Road. The court is not very noticeable from Barnwood Avenue, hidden as it is behind a high wall. In this picture, on the left is the vicarage bungalow. Here we have Barnwood Avenue dipping down towards the brook and onwards to Barnwood Road. Still tree-lined, though the trees are relatively recent. Now we go back a bit in time, and the view from this spot is far more rural. There are no houses, and the far end of the avenue is heavily tree-lined. Note the white palisade fencing where the avenue crosses the brook. Now we move forward a few years to 1898. The trees along the avenue are somewhat leafier. The fields on the left are yet to be built on, and there is just one development on the right of that road, a pair of houses, West Grove being just visible, with East Grove out of the picture to the right. Standing in the avenue, looking very smart, are Helen and Hilda. We do not know who Hilda is, but we think that Helen, on the right, is Mrs. Ridderford. More of her later. Looking back up the avenue from this spot, this painting shows the tree-lined avenue continuing southwards towards the court, with the church clearly visible on the left. A picture that reminds us that this area was rural until quite recently. This is that view today. Just one white post remains of the palisade, and the church is slightly less visible behind the new tree line. Remarkably, this patch of ground has remained an open space, while the fields that were to the west of the avenue now contain housing. The reason for this is that in 1935, when the Barnwood Court estate was sold for housing, concern was expressed that the houses would be built on Church Meadow, this meadow, thus losing the fine view of the church and also the loss of an area of open space. Eventually, sufficient funds were raised so that the field could be purchased from the developers and thus preserved for the parishioners of Barnwood. Here we have a map of the Barnwood Court estate, highlighted the manor house here in blue. If we go down the avenue slightly, I've circled in red where the avenue crosses the wooden brook. If you notice, a footpath runs diagonally across the field to the church, across to Church Lane and onwards into Matson. And before the construction of housing, a similar path ran westward towards the Barton area of Gloucester. This was the only crossing of the Wooden Brook in Barnwood and must have been used quite frequently. Crossing the brook and moving up Barnwood Avenue towards Barnwood Road. Behind protective railings could be seen an alleyway, today used by pupils attending Barnwood School. This alleyway once ran from here right through to the centre of Gloucester. Now blocked off in places, its line can still be traced from Barnwood Avenue through to Eastern Avenue, over the railway line into Armscroft, up Wotton Pitch, across Horton Road and down the back of houses in London Road where it is known as Royal Well Lane. It follows the underpass at the railway station and probably entered the town of Gloucester at the North Gate. It is thought that this lane was once used by monks of St. Peter's Abbey when they travelled to Barnwood either to collect tithes from the courthouse or to take services in the adjoining chapel. Here, on the old map, the church and the courthouse are circled, and the path that the monks would have taken is drawn in yellow as it wends its way from the church over the brook and westwards, parallel to Barnwood and London roads. How accurate this story is, I'm not sure, but it certainly makes for a nice and probable story. Most of this can be walked today. The alley no longer crosses the railway line, of course, and the section up the wooden pitch was closed off as it became unsavoury several tens of years ago. So, Barnwood Avenue was once gated. It was tree-lined, and it led to a courthouse standing in a large estate. This was that imposing entrance in 1882. Today the gates have gone. There are fewer trees lining the avenue, and the grounds have been replaced with housing. But the history is still there if you know what to look for.
Well, that was part one of a walk around Barnwood. Join me again for part two, when we'll go from west to east down Barnwood Road, looking at some of the houses there and talking about the people that lived in them. But until then, take care.